party started, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the launch of World Protests, a study of key protest issues in the 21st century. And this is, of course, a collaboration between the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung and the Initiative for Policy Dialogue, which is a nonprofit organization based at Columbia University here in New York. We are looking forward to taking a deeper look at a study that analyzed more than 900 protest movements in more than 100 countries worldwide. Thousands of hours of work went into this study over the span of several years. And with this in mind, I wanted to quickly say thank you to the authors and of course to our panelists for joining us today and for making this possible. We are very proud of this book. And honestly, we are also a little overwhelmed by the attention that this book has generated. We just got the numbers in today, and I mean, the book has just been out for a couple of days, but it's been downloaded thousands of times. And it really has received enthusiastic feedback from researchers and activists from around the world. I think this doesn't come out of nowhere.
Todas partes del mundo. Creo que esto no viene
because protests around the world have been getting such a dubious reputation lately. And the study produces an abundance of data to counteract negative generalizations. In fact, the study shows that the vast majority of protests around the world call for absolutely reasonable demands. People protest to call for decent jobs, for a cleaner planet, for a meaningful political voice. And as such, it's a valuable reminder that protests are a core tenet of our democracy. Now, I'm representing a German organization here, and I think that from this perspective, the discussion that we are having on this very day is important, and it's fitting that it's happening on this very day, because as you may know, the 9th of November is a very special day in German history. In fact, there are 4 key events that occurred on this very day in the course of a arguably very short century, and they all somehow relate to the topic of our discussion today. On November 9th, 1918, the German emperor abdicated in the wake of Germany's first successful revolution. But November 9th, 1923 is also the date of Adolf Hitler's failed beer hall putsch. November 9th, 1938 is of course the shameful night of broken glass when a Nazi mob burned down synagogues and Jewish property and murdered hundreds of German Jews. And more recently, November 9th, 1989, was of course also the fall of the Berlin Wall, which was driven by protests across Eastern Germany. And of course, these protests attest to the power of peaceful resistance against a repressive regime. Of course, these are coincidences, but to me, that does not deprive them of meaning. November 9th encapsulates the promises, the potentials, and also the pitfalls of protests. And to keep this in mind can only help to contextualize the analysis of protests today. With this quick look back to the past, I would like to welcome you one more time for this event and for this fascinating discussion. And I would like to hand over the mic to Ines Pohl from Deutsche Welle, who has kindly agreed to moderate our discussion today. Thank you very much for joining us from around the world. Ines, over to you.
Michael, thank you so much, and also a warm welcome to our international audience to this very exciting discussion. I think indeed there couldn't be a better day and a better time to talk about how Michael just put it, the promises and potentials of worldwide protests. I just walk you briefly through the next 1.5 hours. We will start this session with a presentation of the study from the authors. This is Isabel Ortiz. She's the head of the social justice program at the Columbia University. Mohamed Berrada, he's an economist and a data journalist. We'll also talk about the study because he's one of the authors, as is Hernan Cortés. He's an international relations expert, and Sarah Burke, she's a senior policy analyst from the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung in New York. So they will start the session with about 20 minutes introduction with some slides. So that's going to be really interesting. That will kind of clear the field. So we are all a little bit on the same page. And then we will have fantastic panelists who start a discussion with each other. And then I would like you, dear viewers, to join us. Put in your questions. You can do that via Zoom. You can also use social media with the hashtag world protest to join the discussion and maybe to fuel the discussion. But at this point, I say thank you for your interest, and Isabel, the mic is yours.
Thank you very much, Ines. It is really great to be here today to present this study, because it has taken years to compile. And we started in 2013. And the reason why is because we saw at the time that there were many protests. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to share some slides, if you allow me, to guide you through the book and get your interest. So let's hope it works. Okay. So, as mentioned, in 2013, we saw that there were many protests. We realized there was from the Arab Spring to the many protests in Europe and all around the world about austerity. So we started questioning, why do people protest? Who is demonstrating? What methods are they using? Like there were new methods like internet-based. Who did the protesters oppose? Did they achieve anything? Was there repression? So what we did is starting and looking for protest country by country. And in this book, we present the results for 101 countries, covering 93% of the world population. That was done in 6 languages. And the results are here. The first one, which is quite surprising, is actually to see that world protests are increasing significantly in all world regions. So it's not a phenomena only of the Arab Spring or the European anti-austerity protests. This is happening all over the world. If we want to see what the story tells us of protests, we classify protests. People protest about many things, but we classify them in 4 main categories. The first category, it is the blue line. It will be protests for economic justice and against austerity. So as you can see after and what you have here is by year. So what you can see is after the global financial crisis, and particularly after 2010, when governments started implementing austerity measures all over the world, not just in Europe. So we see a first jump of a huge amount of protests happening that, however, mellows down about 2014. What happens then is another type of protest, the orange line, that we have called failures of democracy or failure of political representation, to use a more academic term. This second type of protest, orange, start growing massively, mostly responding to the frustration of protesters. What we see then is a rise of what is called Omnibus Protest. That means protesting many issues, demanding many issues, not just a concrete issue like before, that it may be opposition to austerity cuts or to pension reform, or because fuel prices were rising. This time, it's about many things at the same time. And we see that growing up to today. Actually, the pandemic, despite the pandemic, actually, the number of protests continues increasing. Then we have a third category of protest, that is the yellow line, and these are civil rights protests. And this particularly takes up the number of protests after 2018 with the Me Too women's protest and the Black Lives Matter racial protest. And last but not least, there are a number of protests, this is the green line, that relate to global justice. And these are issues like climate justice, like against the international financial institutions, like against free trade, G20 and others. So the book, going quickly, then analyzes each of these demands and grievances of protest. It gives examples in each category, so you can see it, and it gives the exact numbers and divides them by, you can see how they evolve in terms of regions or country areas like high income, lower income, and And so you can see these graphs like this one. So it's just to pick your interest. So here, for instance, in failures democracy or political representation, the main demand, large one, is for real democracy and against corruption. And other issues are justice, transparency and accountability, the belief that there is a deep government or oligarchy that controls things, etc. Second big category, as we were describing before, the protests for economic justice and against austerity. Here, the large categories: jobs, wages, and labor conditions. The second is protests for public services. The third one is against corporate influence, the regulation and privatization, for tax justice, agrarian reform, fuel and energy prices, pension reform, housing, food prices, others. The third category of civil rights that we're saying, the first and most largest protests are about racial justice and indigenous movements, very important in Latin America. Then others are rights to the commons, freedom of assembly, speech, press, women's rights, sexual rights, and others. And last but not least, the global justice category, in which there are protests for climate justice, anti-international financial institution, anti-imperialism, anti-free trade, anti-G20, and others. Another important question that we dealt with, it was who is really protesting? And what we found is that together with non-governmental organizations, trade unions, parties and movements, which was the classical activist, we find actually the very important rise of grassroots protest. And this means that many people, many middle-class people, actually are going to the streets because they feel disenfranchised. We're talking about pensioners, women, young people, people that they don't consider themselves activists. However, they are manifesting. And what is important of this also is realizing that the classical alliance between the middle class and elites seems to be breaking, and because they feel disenfranchised from the system. And not only we have a large number of protests and protesters, we actually have some of the largest protests in world history altogether, like it was in India, the strike last year against President Modi's plan to liberalize farming and labor, which mobilized 250 million people and others. As many as 52 protests in the study had more than 1 million people, according to crowd counts, with all the doubts that these crowd counts can have. What methods did protesters use? We found as many as 250 methods of peaceful protests, and we are all described there, so you might want to have some idea. Some are very new, like internet activism, that did not exist in earlier years, so that was interesting to research too. But overwhelmingly, the most common method of protesters is using marches and protest assemblies. Then we also have, as mentioned, internet activism, blockades, occupations, formal statements, and we see violence, vandalism, and looting representing about 19% of all protests in the period. And what is worse, probably because of the rise in the frustration of protesters, this number is growing. I mean, in 2020, it was 21%. Another topic we found interesting to research, it was what did protesters oppose? Which were the main targets of protesters? And protesters did right. 80% of protests are against national governments. That's the right thing to do, because governments are the legitimate institution that is supposed to look for the interest of citizens. But other persons, other groups that they were opposing were political and economic system, corporations and employers, up to 23% of protest, elites, the military and police, 14% protest. And look at this one, which are interesting data. The European Union, and that's not only in Europe, also in countries of Africa, 10% of global protest. And the International Monetary Fund, other 10%, the financial sector against the United States and others. So what did all these protests achieve? Now, we found that 42% of protests did result in some type of achievement. Now, this means loosely defined that they did not achieve the whole objective that they wanted, but they might have achieved something, a partial objective. Now, there's a number of lessons here. One was that the longer protests exist, actually, the more chances to achieve something. The second important lesson was that the more concrete the protest, the more chances to actually achieve a result. So let's say you protest because you want a wage increase, or you want a better working condition, or something very specific. Your chances are higher than not confronting a very abstract and distant enemy. For instance, the group of 20, that of free trade. This becomes very, very difficult to achieve things towards them, the financial sector or others. That's to pique your interest on what the book contains. Okay, we also had to ask the question: was there repression? And then, very unfortunately, we found that many governments actually increasing repression of protests in terms of arrests, of injuries, and deaths. And we do depict the governments with the largest numbers. The book then has other sections that my colleagues, Hernan, Mohamed, and Sarah are going to present, but I just would like to close with a couple of takeaways. And the first one is that we live a world with increasing inequality, and perhaps not surprisingly, we have increasing social instability as a result. And call your attention that peaceful protests are a fundamental aspect of a vibrant democracy. Most of the demands of protesters are in full accordance with human rights and international agreed UN development goals. So the study calls for policymakers to listen and act on these legitimate demands. Thank you very much. The book is for free download as well. Don't forget to visit the interactive website. It is worldprotest.org. Thank you very much. Now I'll pass the word to my friend, to my colleague, Mohamed Verada.
Okay, I think everybody can see my screen. Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here with us. Thank you, Isabel, for this presentation. I'm going to focus on a part of the book that's slightly different. So I'm going to go a little bit into more detail. And what I'm going to talk about is inequality and protest, and the relationship between economic protests and political-based protests. So let's first look at inequality and protest movements. That is, we're talking here about economic inequality. And what we find is that it's a matter of changing level. Rising inequalities over time, over the period that we've studied, show a correlation with a more important number of protests in the countries where inequality was rising, and lowering inequalities show a correlation with a decreased number of protests. So what we can say here is that what we observe is that over time, if your country is getting more and more equal, and there's more equality, you have less and less dissent. And if you have more and more inequality, you have more and more dissent as it's growing. And this is something that confirms a long-standing tradition within the social sciences, linking between inequality and discontent. So this is not something new, but this is something that the study confirms. So we move on to ask, what is the relationship between demands regarding economic justice and against austerity, and demands regarding failures of political democracy, failures of political representations, and failures of democracy? So moving on to the next slide, what we see here is a little bit of analysis of what happened over the past 15 years. So what we saw globally has also been true regionally. So in the global graph that you see on the right here, we see a large rise following the 2008 financial crisis of protests related to economic issues. And then the protests relating to economic issues kind of lower down and are taken over by protests relating to failures of political representations or failure of democracy. So if we look a little bit into more detail, if you take a look at the Middle East and North Africa, which is on the lower side at the left, what we see is that we tend to see this movement twice in this region. So before the Arab Spring, there is a first wave of demands that relate to economic justice, demands for jobs, demands for more equality, demands for redistribution. And then those lower down, and there's a very quick high peak regarding failures of political representations. This is what we have called the Arab Spring. And then the promises of the Arab Spring have sort of tempered down. demands for economic justice and for redistribution pick up again around 2016, 2017, and then we end up in what some have called the second Arab Spring, 2018 to 2020. So this rise is also visible. If you take a look in Latin America, it's also very clear there. So the latest events in Latin America, which some have called the Latin American Spring, also, although it has been maybe a bit overshadowed by the COVID crisis, and so we didn't talk about it as much as we talked about the Arab Spring, but we see the same thing. Prior to these movements relating to failures of political representations and failures of democracy, there is a very large wave related to people demanding better jobs, better living conditions, better redistribution of resources. And when we break it down regionally, it actually turns out to be true in every single region in the planet. So this pattern that we see, that this rise, this first wave of economic demand, and then it slows down and it's taken over by protests that go against the system itself and that call for more democracy and for a change in the system. It's almost as if the data was saying something like, if a system cannot deliver better economic life, then it's best to reform it or to change it. I would like to thank you for your time. I leave the floor to my colleague Hernan Cortez, who's gonna take us a little deeper into corruption and protest.
Thank you very much, Mohamed. I'm gonna share my screen so you can see a very interesting graph about corruption, which is definitely one of the things, as Isabel was saying. And the increase of inequality, as Oxfam is always stressing out, and the increase of power of some elites to use the system in their favor. Corruption is present in 558 protest episodes, which it's around 20% of all protests analyzed, which is a lot. And it's the second most occurrent cause of protest all over these 15 years, which highlights the importance of this topic in the analysis that we have done and in protests during these 15 years. You can see in the bar graph at the left how it has increased its prevalence during the period of study. Thus, it has become, we could definitely say that corruption, and when we say corruption, we definitely mean grand corruption, it has become one of the defining issues of the last 15 years, and one of the reasons why people has protested a lot in different regions of the world. 5 elements are worth highlighting when we talk about corruption during this period. The first one is that, as you can see in the big graph, it is present in all the regions of the world, but mainly in Europe and Central Asia. Second, corruption is related with this point that I have just mentioned. Corruption, protests against corruption happen everywhere, regardless of income. So this is destroying the big mantra that has been said for many years, that corruption is linked to developing countries. This is not true. Corruption happens everywhere. Another interesting element is that our analysis is highlighting is that in many cases, as I was saying before, this is not about petty crime, but what we call grand corruption or even political capture. Thus, the importance of the idea of the 1% versus 99%, as Occupy Wall Street was saying almost like 15 years ago or 10 years ago, or the claim that we have heard many times that the system is rigged and favoring the elite at the expense of the rest of us. This kind of big protest against like grand corruption, political capture, trying to just like change everything, we have seen them recently in Algeria, in Lebanon, in Peru, in France, in different countries all over the world. The fourth point to highlight is that protests against corruption not only target national governments, and this is something very interesting, but as well international financial institutions that sometimes are linked to corruption, to grand corruption, and what we call the meddlers. Those actors who are capable of linking the dots between big corporations and the private sector and the national governments, like big consultancy firms or lawyer firms, as we saw with the Pandora Papers. And last but not least, many protests against grand corruption target what Isabel was saying, the rules of the game, and try to change the status quo. So they're trying to create a revolt, a social revolt in the country, which is something very complicated to achieve. And that we have seen like very few cases. Well, this is happening, even though like many of these protests create like a big change in the narrative in the political culture in some countries. But it has led in several occasions to the prime ministers and presidents stepping down. So in a nutshell, before passing it over to my colleague Sarah Berg, corruption has become a crucial issue of our time, and governments need to address it from a global perspective, targeting the symmetries of power relations that leads to grand corruption. So Sarah, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hernan. When we began this study back in 2013, in many ways, we were looking at protests through what we might call a progressive lens. But as we concluded the first stage of research, we started to notice more and more instances of a rights-based demand where people were calling not for the enforcement of their own rights, but to deny rights to other groups based on their gender, ethnicity, race, religion, or nationality. So now I'm going to share a screen with you. One more slide. This graph shows the other demands that we found clustered along with this demand to deny rights. These include sovereignty and patriotic issues, and demands for personal freedoms like the freedom not to wear a mask or not to be quarantined, which we obviously began to see only in 2020. They show a mistrust of the deep state and anger at corruption, but also unresolved calls for better wages and working conditions and demands for justice and democracy. Many of these protests also became violent. So there's still a very small percentage of protests overall, which by and large are peaceful and call for human rights that are already agreed to at an international level. So while these protests are not representative of most protests around the world, we couldn't ignore them. At this point, I want to make sure everyone understands how we arrived at our assessment of demands and grievances. Rather than inferring different protest movements' demands, we tried to accept the demands in the protesters' own words when they were available. That's how we know many right-wing populists were also calling for jobs, justice, and democracy. But one group's democracy is another group's autocracy. The big picture here is that there was a wave of populist protests in the years following the 2008 financial crisis that were anti-authoritarian and that were inclusive in their populist orientation. Occupy Wall Street is just one example. These protests raised questions about economic justice against a backdrop of historic economic inequality, which my other co-authors, especially Isabel, has raised, and Mohammed. The well-being of the 99% against the greed and corruption of the 1%. But the failure to hold financial firms and managers accountable, the continued supremacy of the Davos class, and the fact that the economic injustices attributed to globalization were not resolved. These things opened the door to a second wave of populism, one that was susceptible to authoritarian influence, that was even in some case weaponized. The January 6th protesters who stormed the US Capitol fit that profile, as do many others around the world. So in conclusion, what we want to say is too many leaders in government and business are not listening. The vast majority of protests around the world advance reasonable demands already agreed to by most governments. People protest for good jobs, a clean planet for their children and their grandchildren and future generations, and a meaningful say in the decisions that affect their quality of life. So a heartfelt thanks to everyone who made time to be online with us today. We look forward to your questions and to a great discussion with our distinguished panel. Back to you, Ines.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you all. What a fantastic study. I'm so glad that our vacation time is just ahead. So I think we should all download this book and read it not only over Thanksgiving, but maybe also over Christmas and then leading into the new year. There are many things I would like to refer to, but I don't want take too much time. But I think it's what I really like, Sarah, is how you put it. It's about the well-being of the 99% and about inclusive and anti-authoritarian protests. And that sometimes it's easy to kind of get a little bit confused with populists because they use the same words. They're fighting for better jobs, they're fighting for better well-being, but we always have to ask the bigger question, really kind of, who would get something out of their wishes? I start our discussion and encourage you, dear audience, again, please take part, use Zoom, put in your questions or use our social media hashtag World Protest to join our discussion. But I will start with Walden Bellow and address the first question to you, Walden. You are a human rights activist focused on the global south. You are running for vice president of the Philippines. And I would like you to talk a little bit about the worldwide solidarity. So how much or how big is the support from richer countries? And maybe you can also talk a little bit about the question how nationalistic are the protests within the global south. Walden, floor is yours. You have to turn on your microphone.
Yes, thank you very much. Can you hear me now? Yes, and I'd really like to thank the authors for a fantastic study. I mean, there's such a wealth of data that I think has been made available to so many of us that are, looking into the politics and the consequences of global protests. So a very, very important study. I would just like to address a few things, more from somebody who has been engaged with protests, not so much as an analyst, but into the dynamics of some of the dynamics of protest movements at this point. Let me, for instance, underline the importance of generation in some of these protests. I think that a classic case of young people, millennials, taking to the streets and demanding quite a number of demands, but principally for political representation, but then create a space for other sectors of society and all their generations in order to move into this protest space is what has happened in Thailand, over the last 5 years, where I think we can see that younger Thais have really made use of the spaces of protest and have become the cutting edge of reform and transformation, which has not yet ended. I mean, this is headed towards a major confrontation with the government at this point, with the traditional elites. And this is the sort of thing that we need to look at and have to have solidarity with. Another thing that I would cite from Asia, again, to try to make this protest concrete, is a whole of society protest against a very isolated government. I mean, practically everybody in civil society, the whole population, ethnic groups are united against a government that's just holding on to power by guns, is what we see in Myanmar, especially over the last 2 years. And how, when you talk about international solidarity, the international solidarity with both in Thailand and particularly with Myanmar at this point, is extremely necessary, because there comes a time when protests and guns are in a stalemate. And that is what you see in Myanmar. And international solidarity can, in fact, be the factor that can break the impasse in favor of those who are protesting. And so that's one other thing I wanted to point out. The third thing I wanted to point out has been what Sarah talked about, which is not to underestimate the rise of right-wing protests, especially in the United States and in Europe. And the exclusionary character of this protests. It's very interesting that what you have is really a variant of National Socialism that is taking place in Europe at this point in time and in the United States. Basically, cherry picking themes traditionally associated with the left, but defining them in exclusivist directions. Yes, the welfare state, but only for those of the right color, quote unquote, the right culture, and the right religion. So basically the effort to redefine society as those who, because of certain characteristics, can have access to most of the benefits of society, while others, defined as outsiders, usually in Europe, defined as migrants, should really be excluded, from the benefits, that the dominant sector enjoys. And I think that's what is worrisome at this point in the United States. I mean, we do have in the US, yes, we've had progressive protests like Black Lives Matter over the last few years, and especially the last year. But I think what is very significant at this point is the January 6th protest, and how I think that heralds to some extent the future, because what we have in the United States at this point is an undeclared civil war, whereby a white majority that is diminishing in its majority is very susceptible to sort of racial exclusivist protests, themes that have been was articulated by Trump. So this is the kind of a right-wing protest movement, exclusivist, and increasingly, making the white diminishing majority very susceptible to its frantic calls. And I think this is the situation that we really need to watch out for, both in Europe and the United States, this deep polarization that is taking place. And as I have called it, an undeclared civil war between basically a white Republican party appealing to allied racism and the rest of society. Okay, now the final thing, which has to be, relates to my run for office, is how it is very important for progressives to be able to articulate the energy of the streets, okay, into parliamentary politics. How do we capture that energy and break down the vested interests that are the gatekeepers of parliamentary politics? And I think that that is the challenge to a lot of us. Certainly in the Philippines, that is the challenge. You have vested interests that control Congress. How do we break that apart? And the only way that I think that can happen is if we bring the energy of the streets into the halls of parliament. We used to call it the parliament of the streets. And in my own experience, we've had examples of that where people basically said, oh, Congress is much too controlled by vested interests. You can't break through. But we were able to do it. We were able to do it on several issues. The reproductive rights bill in the Philippines, where we went up against the tremendous hold of the Catholic Church, and we won on reproductive rights. And we were able to do that against landlord interests when it came to the extension of land reform in the redistribution of land. So, that combination of smart parliamentary tactics, but even more important, the energies of the streets, that is sort of the demand that challenge us as practicing political activists who engage in the parliamentary arena. So again, let me end there. Tremendous congratulations to the authors and to FEAS for sponsoring this great study. It will keep us, it gives us a lot of fodder for a real thinking and for doing real politics. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Walden. That was a wonderful opening of the debate, talking about racial exclusiveness, talking about the big question, how to take the energy from the streets, as you said it, into the halls of government. And you also talked about the importance of the younger generation. And that's a great lead to Tinashe Mazala. She's the co-founder of the Center for Young Leaders in Africa. Tinashe, maybe you can talk a little bit about the importance of social media to organize protests, especially when it comes to the next or to the younger generation, and maybe a little bit about the advantages, but maybe also about the challenges and maybe disadvantages of the use of social media to organize protests. Tinashe.
Hello, Ines. I think social media has become a very important tool, and what you will see with many of these protests that have been happening, especially those that have occurred in the age of social media played a role as a catalyst. If we talk about the Arab Spring.
Sorry to interrupt you. I would love to see your face, and I'm sure our viewers as well. Could you turn on the camera? If not, if it's not working. Are you still with us, Tinashe? This is the beauty of live discussions. I just remind you, you can participate by using our hashtag World Protest in social media. And now I see Tinashe. Tinashe, please.
Are you able to hear me? My apologies, the internet has been shaky this past week.
We see you and we hear you, so please continue.
Okay, wonderful. So before I was cut off, I was just saying that social media has been a very effective tool in the protests that have happened in the past few months, particularly among a group of young people. The beauty with social media is you can get information in real time. You can have people share and document things that are happening in real time and have people. It's also been a great tool to help organize people together, because I'll give you an example. And I know one of the things I noted when I read the book was last year here in Zambia, we had a series of protests that happened, but they were not documented. I think the last protest documented in Zambia were 2018. And this year in Zambia, we had our elections. And the protests that happened last year served as a backdrop for the change of government this year. We had young people that were not being permitted by the police to hold peaceful protests, and they took to social media. They went out into the bush, went into an unknown location, and they protested. So whereas the police would have come in and arrested them wherever they were going to be, or the location that they had handed to the police of their desired peaceful protest, they went out into the bush and they streamed it live on social media, and it got so much reach. And even in the same regard, another way in which the Zambian youth protested using social media this year was during our election. It's alleged that the government shut down connectivity to social media platforms. And this happened while people were still in the lines waiting to vote. And that made people enraged, and even, I feel, fueled people to vote against the previous government and vote for the sitting government. So social media has been a very powerful tool. On the other hand, it does have some disadvantages, because whereas with traditional media, where there's regulations and journalists like yourself are held to a code of ethics and a code of standards, anyone can be a journalist and anyone can disseminate information. And and the sad thing is, no one really takes the time to verify whether these sources are credible, whether what they're saying are true. And also, like with many times, information can sometimes be misconstrued, even though it was true at its starting point. By the time it gets shared down the line, there's a change and there's a distortion in the information. So one of the disadvantages of social media, we have seen people get bullied to the point of taking their own lives. We've seen people share wrong information and incite acts of violence over things that weren't even true. So it definitely is a strong tool, but it definitely calls for more regulation, because people will not, for more self-regulation by the users, because it's also such a powerful tool that it could cause harm.
What could be done regarding this self-regulation? Would you kind of think that maybe some really influential leaders of specific protest movements should kind of ask their followers for a more regulated way? I mean, because that is a huge question, right? On the one hand, it's very positive. It really helps people coming together, finding a voice, getting the reach. But as you just elaborated on the other hand, it can be dangerous. What can be done to kind of stop fake news from overtaking, in a way, also some of the protest movements?
You know, it's a very tricky thing, because you also do not want to create legislation and laws to sort of bar people using the internet. But then there is a point where we do need people who've been offended using the internet to have some sort of legal redress, because there are certain times where it does get extreme. And in incidences, I'll give you an incident in Zambia, for example, where the previous government passed certain laws to regulate the use of the internet and online related things, which, when you analyze critically, have many provisions that could be abused by ill leaders that have ill intent. I'll give you an example of Uganda, for example, where it is regular practice for them to have the internet shut down and them have limitations on access to the internet. So it's dangerous. But then, like you said, I think using influencers and using leaders to actually teach people and to inform them about the importance and the dangers of the use of the internet, because it can really get dangerous.
Actually, I have a question from a viewer, from Matthew Martin. I would like to address to you. Maybe you can answer that. So the study looks at many protests deeply and different ways to protest. He wants to know if you or if one of you guys have an example whether protests have successfully influenced governments to change their policies. Do you have an example from the continent with 54 countries? Did any protests really lead to a specific change of policymakers?
If may I...
It depends. Oh, sure. You can go ahead.
No, please, you go ahead.
Tinashe first, and then I hand it over to Isabel. But Tinashe first, please.
No problem. So I was just going to say, it also depends on how you would like to term the influenced, because if I will say, like, off the top of my head, I cannot think of a specific incident where things happen instantaneously. Maybe apart from the Arab Spring with the man that burned himself, and maybe there's a few incidents in the Arab Spring where 18 days later a government was overthrown and things like that. But then sometimes things happen gradually. I'll give you an example of Nigeria, where they had protests against police brutality. And in reality, nothing changed seriously, but then we can see that sometimes these protests make put the government on their toes. And with time, you start to weaken these strong institutions and these barriers that exist between fighting the inequality. And I'll hand over to Isabel.
Isabel, it's you.
Yes. Well, the question is, if we look from the book lenses, okay? So what we did, this is a huge study. So what you have, it will be a protest that actually were classified as inequality and got some success. And let me give you an example here. It will be when the terms of 1%, the 1% versus the 99%, when was put forward, that actually can be considered a success, because actually these terms are now of popular use. At the beginning, people did not have a clue what it was, but so it has spread and it has become common spread. But then the book has many other examples of successful policies that actually were achieved from governments and that actually helped not to increase inequality. Let me give you some examples. For instance, in Ireland in 2016, there was massive demonstrations against a water charge, and that was part of an austerity program. And finally, the water charge was not put. In South Africa, also in 2016, there were claims, students went to the streets not to have student fees, and they managed that. Their student fees were not put. In Saudi Arabia, for instance, there have been a long time claims for women to vote, and so in Senegal. And finally, both countries managed to get women voting in 2015. And I can go to many examples like that. Pension reforms that have been, stopped because of protest of people in the streets. For instance, in France in 2010, Nicaragua 2013, Portugal 2010, Russia 2018. So, there are many victories, popular victories using protest against, government badly designed policies because they had highly negative social impacts.
Thank you so much, Isabel, for adding this on. And Tinashe, thank you so much for your input. I now would like to bring Owen Tudor into our discussion. Owen, you are the Deputy General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation. We learned from the study that 80% of the protests demand their governments to take responsibility for economical policies. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit if there is a possibility to increase the impact of worldwide protests, or is this maybe a naive question because every country kind of has its own problems and its own solutions? Owen.
So let me first say thank you very much to the authors of these studies, which are absolutely fascinating, and also thank you to those putting on this event. I'm joining you from Lisbon in Portugal at the moment, where the European Trade Union Confederation are holding their midterm conference. The global trade union movement, the International Trade Union Confederation, just for anybody who doesn't know us, brings together 200 million trade union members in 163 countries and territories around the world. If we were a country ourselves, we'd be one of the 10 biggest on the planet. We regularly survey people. We have all sorts of ways of finding out things about what's going on in the world, including our democratic structures, but we regularly survey people across a range of countries representing the majority of the global population. And we found over the last year or two that 2/3 of the people we speak to say that people like them have no influence on the global economy. 71% say that their country's economy favors the wealthy, and 69% support, for instance, higher taxes on wealthy and large corporations to fund education, training, health, other public goods. But one of the overriding things that comes out of those surveys is that trust in government is closely related to whether government is delivering. And I think that underpins both left-wing and right-wing protests. So there are common issues across all countries. I mean, all politics traditionally is described as local, but it does seem like economics is global and has been increasingly so over the last 20 20 or 30 years. Trade unions obviously range from local workplaces where, you know, you could have a union rep who's representing 5 or 10 people, all the way up to the global level. We've got a team at the moment, for instance, in Glasgow for the COP negotiations, inside and outside the negotiating environment. And we channel the voices that our members generate. Let me quote Martin Luther King, worth noting, by the way, that he was assassinated in Memphis, where he journeyed in support of striking African-American city sanitation workers who were protesting about unequal wages and working conditions in their local municipality. In a sense, 3 out of the 4 categories of struggle that Isabel mentioned earlier. But Martin Luther King said that riots were the voice of the voiceless. He wasn't in favor of riots. That was partly a criticism. But trade unions can be that voice, and more than a voice. And here I'm coming to trying to answer your question. We don't just amplify the voices of the voiceless, we reach agreements. We and we're not the only people who do this, obviously, but just as an example of how you can generalize popular movements of protest in individual countries, we reach agreements with employers and governments at the International Labour Organization, such as the recent Convention Against Gender-Based Violence at Work. We set the context for economic change, coordinating at the international financial institutions, the IMF, which I saw got far more protests than the World Bank. We target both of them in terms of things like debt negotiations, which are crucial to the issue of Black Lives Matter around the world. We focus on the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization, the G20. We are even present at Davos, although I accept that we're a really small voice of the voiceless at Davos, and I know colleagues from Oxfam will bear that out. Critical to turning those voices of local protests into global activity that actually delivers real change is the right to protest, the right to strike. Strikes, remember, are a sort of workplace protest as well as being sometimes a more political version. And those are under threat, and they are absolutely key to the process. So what I'd say is, it is entirely possible to generalize those local disputes and protests. What I would say is that I think in the categorization, for instance, that Isabel just gave, the answer that she just gave to the successful protests, protests in that way, in that on the streets marching sort of vision of protest, are more successful at stopping things happen than they are in making things happen, because to make things happen, you need to translate that popular protest and give it some form. Walden talked about taking it into Parliament. We take it into boardrooms and government rooms as well. But I think that whilst it's not impossible to identify protests that have actually led to a positive change directly, it's much easier to see them as ways of venting protest. And in that sense, can I just say, I realize you're dealing with the time series, but I'm not convinced that the idea of right-wing populist protests is actually as recent as that suggests. In my own country, in the United Kingdom, for instance, there were 2 marches in the early part of the century that produced more than 1 million people on the streets. One of them was against the Iraq War, which was the sort of march that our people were on. One of them was run by an organization called the Countryside Alliance, who it could be suggested were attempting to restrict the rights of foxes.
Would any of the authors like to answer to that last remark regarding the not so new race of right-wing populists or protests from right-wing populists? Sarah, you?
I can say a little bit about that. Obviously, our study begins in 2006, and I think your first example was prior to that. And this is not to say that there wasn't there were not instances of right-wing protests earlier on, but I feel pretty convinced by the research that we've done that there are rising numbers, and that in many ways, you know, another thing that we've seen is that a lot of middle-class people who would not have thought of themselves as activists before are being drawn into all kinds of protests. An example, you know, would be like the yellow vest protests that have been in France, but also in Ireland and in other places, drawing in people from kind of both the right and the left around a collection of grievances, many of them economic. And it's these populations that are, I think, particularly susceptible to the authoritarian influence. So I think that's what we see. It's not necessarily that we have consolidated right-wing groups with a solid history and a membership list that are going out and organizing these protests, but that people are drawn out and more susceptible to influence by the right wing.
Owen, do you want
just
to?
very quickly, Ines, I mean, so I agree absolutely that Sarah is to a certain extent thrown under a bus by the time series that you were dealing with, and you were delegated to do this bit of the job. I mean, I would say that fundamentally, and I absolutely accept that there is a clear movement of strategy on the extreme right to mobilize people, but really that is not new. We saw that in the pre-First World War period in Russia and Eastern Europe, for instance. Pogroms were not just a state phenomenon. We saw it in the 20s and 30s in Europe, for instance. Recently, just a few weeks ago, the anti-vaccination protests that took place in Italy led to the storming of a trade union national headquarters for the first time since the fascism of the 1920s in Italy. So it is undoubtedly a strategy of the extreme right. But I'd go back to what I said earlier, which is that even those protests, those right-wing protests, even those ones that involve, I'm not entirely happy with the middle class definition, because obviously it varies hugely if you're talking about the US or Europe or things like that, how you define them. But fundamentally, populist protests are the result of governments not delivering in some way, and not delivering economically as well. Now that can be mobilized by the left, calling for more economic equality and for more state investment and more, sort of more green jobs and so on, or it can be mobilized by the right to foster racism and attacks on LGBTQ communities or the rights of women, for instance. But what lies at the bottom of it is the failure of governments to deliver for the people. As governments get more owned by the wealthy, that's going to increase. Whether it goes to left-wing protest or right-wing protest is in large part down to how effective we are at mobilizing compared with how the right wing mobilizes.
Super interesting conversation here, I think. And who could be better to join us in that field better than Thomas Frank? I know you wanted to have the last word, but I think you have to jump in here. Thomas is a historian. Maybe I can call you a left-wing populist. You can answer that one, but I know
hell yes.
That you wrote a very influential and important book about the Tea Party. So jump right in here in that discussion.
Yeah. So what Owen was saying about the right sort of capturing the opportunities that would historically have been captured by the left, that is exactly what happened here in my country, the United States of America. In the years 2009, 2010, around in there. And the movement in question was the Tea Party movement. It's part of your study. There were, fairly well-known phenomenon. You had Tea Party protests all over the United States. It was the more or less official protest response to the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about what caused the financial crisis. We can talk about that some other time, but you remember what the Tea Party movement looked like. Marches in the streets, people denouncing banks, and so on. And I want to point out that we talk about whether or not movements are successful. This was a highly successful movement in the sense that it succeeded in mobilizing millions of people, capturing public outrage over the financial crisis, and ultimately getting its way politically. The Tea Party uprising, for example, persuaded then President Barack Obama to abandon his efforts to help out individual homeowners during the financial crisis. The Tea Party pushed him towards austerity. The Tea Party movement then proceeded to get a huge number of people elected, the big right-wing wave election of 2010. And it's not an exaggeration to say that Donald Trump himself, his campaign of 2016, was a product of this Tea Party rising, you know, the way he would badmouth Wall Street banks and so on. His advisor, Steve Bannon, was even more directly connected to it. And I can go into detail about that if you guys want, but you probably don't. Now, we were, you had asked me originally to talk about the relationship between protests and fake news, or protests and the media. And in this case, the connection between the media and the protest is absolutely direct. The Tea Party movement was literally called into being by a famous event on American TV, namely it was called the Rick Santelli rant in February 2009, when a financial news announcer went down on the floor of the Chicago Board of Trade and, gesturing to the traders around him, described these guys as the silent majority, Richard Nixon's famous phrase, and then railed against the bailout bill then before Congress, because he said it would, this is a quote, subsidize the losers' mortgages while forcing us hardworking traders, these average guys, these guys in the Chicago Board of Trade, forcing them to shoulder their neighbors' burdens. So the idea was losers had to lose. This is the seed of the protest movement. Losers have to lose. And 8 days after Santelli's TV rant, you had the first actual Tea Party rally in the park across the street from the White House. I happened to be there in person. I wrote about it in the Wall Street Journal the next day. Anyhow, the rest is history. You had rallies and marches across the country constantly for the next 2 or 3 years. These were never as big as left-wing rallies and marches typically are, but nevertheless, they had an enormous impact. And there was constant cross-fertilization with the media, the main figure here being the TV host Glenn Beck. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Glenn Beck or not, but he's sort of the very definition of fake news. He sort of caught the Tea Party wave. This right-wing TV commentator caught the wave and became this kind of inescapable face of public anger in the early Obama years. He was on the cover of Time magazine. People wrote biographies of him, etc. The Fox News network encouraged the protests, and they saw their own ratings soar as a result of the protests. And this was a strategy that, of course, MSNBC and CNN would adopt themselves during the Trump years. So the larger question of fake news, of populism, and of what to do about all of this are basically, it's all just one big question to me. And the first thing I want to point out, and this is, I think, really important for your viewers to understand, these people are not populists, okay, in the way that, in the original definition of that word. And this is a word that means a lot here in America, and it especially means a lot in the state where I come from, which is the state of Kansas. Yes, the Tea Party movement pretended to take the side of ordinary people against elites. And yes, they pretended to be a third-party protest movement. Yes, they would use these 1930s slogans and pretend to have this workerist, working class appeal, and they would wave their placards in the park like it was the 1960s, and they would scream for the gold standard, and they would talk often about a general strike. Right? They love to talk about this fantasy of a general strike that would bring the world to its knees. What they meant, of course, was a strike by business people. At one point in the Tea Party story. Glenn Beck even deliberately, he used to lead protests in addition to being a TV host, and he deliberately mimicked Martin Luther King's 1963 March on Washington, you know, stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. And it was crazy. Folks, this is not populism. This is cultural theft of the kind that the right in America has used for decades. Now, why do I say this? Why make this distinction? Well, for starters, the word populism was invented here in America, invented in Kansas by the leaders of the original social protest movement in our history. It was this huge, populism was this huge movement, millions and millions of farmers and industrial workers. And they regarded it was a left-wing movement. It was a sort of classic social democratic movement. And they regarded the traders at the Chicago Board of Trade as their sworn enemies. These were the worst people in the world, according to the original populists. They were not the silent majority. They were the villains. They were the parasites, not the producers. The original populists hated the gold standard. They didn't want to impose it on the world. They didn't want to punish the losers, make the losers lose. The populists were the losers. They were the ones that were getting hammered by the economy in the 1890s, coming together in a mass movement to force government to regulate banks and punish the winners, to punish Wall Street and punish the owners of the railroads and stuff like that. Now, the fake news part of the story is fascinating. The misinformation behind all this, because obviously there's tons of it during the Tea Party days, of deliberate misinformation. I mean, the whole point of the Tea Party movement was confusion, right? Calling themselves a Tea Party. Was it a political party? Was it a third party? Was it nonpartisan? Was it just an arm of the Republicans? They deliberately encouraged this confusion. And Tea Party leaders and TV personalities would constantly mischaracterize how the banking system worked in America. They would blame the global financial crisis on a government program from the 1970s that encouraged American banks to issue loans in poor communities. We can talk about this at some other time, but in fact, it had nothing to do with the crisis. But they still do, try to blame the entire global financial crisis on this one piece of legislation. They would try to depict Barack Obama as this demonic persecutor of the hardworking capitalists. They would try to present themselves as a rightful anti-Wall Street protest movement. They were going to fix things by, get this, deregulating the banks. And folks, to this day, Americans still don't understand what really caused the financial crisis. They still don't get the dynamic that was at the heart of it, why it is that a bank might deliberately make bad loans. Okay, we still don't know how that could possibly be. Why? What makes all of this confusion possible? Why do mimic movements like the Tea Party succeed? And I want to suggest to you that it is because the answer to this question is because of the almost complete erasure of the actual populist tradition from our politics here in America. For example, why didn't the mainstream media in this country push back against this constant misunderstanding of the financial crisis, against all of these efforts to, muddle the story and to get Wall Street off the hook for what they had done? Why didn't they do that? Why didn't they correct the record? Because they didn't get it. They either didn't understand predatory finance, or if they did, they were sympathetic to it. I mean, those bankers are tasteful and successful individuals, not to mention the media, they're friends and sources, right? And to this day, our news media here in America still doesn't understand why a banker might deliberately issue bad loans. I mean, they still don't get that, right? There are no populists in financial commentary here in America. Well, what about the Democrats who were in power in those days? Barack Obama, Larry Summers, these guys certainly understood banking, investment banking. They knew what had happened. Why didn't they step up to the camera and give the nation a shot of, old school fiery populism? Why didn't they, fire the officers of the bailed out banks, which they perfectly had the right to do that?
Okay, Frank, that's all super interesting, but let's bring back to the bigger question. We're talking here about protests.
Yeah.
So maybe you can.
So the question is, why does right-wing
such an expert on this topic? Give us a little bit of your take on the future. Which role will like this so-called populist movements play in the next election circle, which kind of is already starting? You think that this protest on the street will matter as much as it did helping Donald Trump getting into the White House?
That's a really good question. I would something like the January 6th protest, which is descended in a lot of ways from the Tea Party movement. I think that's regarded with shame and disgust by most Americans, and I don't think that's going to go anywhere. I think you're going to see other protests, but the fact is that in the absence of legitimate explanations for why the middle class in this country, for example, why that is crumbling, why prosperity doesn't include the rest of us. The right has been very, very effective in this country at capturing that anger. The Tea Party is just one example of this. There are hundreds of others. The right has, since the time of Reagan, has been extremely effective at capturing public anger about this while doing absolutely nothing to solve the problems, or doing very, very little to solve the problems. And the larger sort of question in this country, which there's no way for us to resolve, only for us to understand, is that the left in this country, such as it is, basically identifies itself with the sort of professional elite, the white collar elite. These are people who are technocrats. They respect. I'm thinking about Barack Obama here. I'm thinking about Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton. These are people who respect complexity. They respect academic credentials. They trust their fellow professionals to run everything and get everything right. And this is a way of talking about problems that has virtually zero emotional resonance. Whereas, right-wing protest is emotionally satisfying, right? Things like the Tea Party succeed because they're better than the alternative, which is to say they're better than nothing.
Thomas, Frank, so thank you so much. Fascinating. And I'm sure we will talk and read and watch a lot about the Tea Party and its influence for the next presidential election. Tinashe, you raise your hand. Do you want to jump in here?
Yes, I do. I feel like Mr. Thomas Frank brought up some very good points. And I've now, like from the time that we received the email, I looked him up and started to view some of his books, and I've become a fan of your work. You mentioned how, just to quote you, said, it's not populism, it's cultural theft. And then there's something else. You said there were no populists. And I'm borrowing this idea and now applying it to like more African related issues. And based on the data from the book, I noted that certain issues like China only got 2.7% of the protests, inequality 3.7%, and then the World Bank. So coming in with like the aspect of an interest in development, I would be interested to see, in regards to the question you asked him about the future of where protests are going. I would like to see within the next era, if we can see an increase in protests leading to or stemming from issues like this, inequality, China, the World Bank. Also, for example, coming from an African background, I've seen that most of the protests, 79% were against governments. But sometimes the political systems that we have will continue to ensure that we have the wrong government in place. So it would be critical to see protests going towards the right direction in the next era. And this is because I see that sometimes there tends to be a euphoria around protests. And sometimes people just get sucked in without maybe correctly understanding the issue, or maybe but then because everyone is protesting, it's euphoric and it can be quite magnetic, and it draws people in. So I would would be interesting to see, even in terms of developing the so-called global South, if we could get to a point where we have more populism towards the development agenda. And then we would start to see shift in policy direction and in issues pertaining to inequality, such as inequality against women and young people. So yeah, that really just sparked my mind around that thought. And also, Mr. Thomas Frank, and maybe not on this platform, but I would like to maybe pick your mind about, because you have a wealth of experience about political systems. I don't know how well you understand African political systems and all of those things, given the backdrop of our colonial past and things like that, and where we are likely to be headed. Because you said something about the Tea Party and how you saw that they copied a system and they had more success with the copied system. But when it comes to democracy, for example, this is a copied system. It's something that came after colonialism, and many African countries are not having success with these systems. So yeah, those are my thoughts.
I think this is like, dear Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung, you should really have a follow-up, because these are fascinating questions, I think. And it would be cool to have Thomas and Tinashe discussing exactly these questions, but that would be too much for this last minutes we have left. Time is running out. So Walden started also talking about the importance of women being involved in protests. So I'm very happy to give the floor to our last panelist, Alejandra Aleixo Moncloa. She's the head of the Oxfam office in Peru. And Alejandra, I would like you to talk a little bit about the role women play in modern protests, maybe even girls.
Thank you, Ines, and thank you and congratulations for the authors. I really, it's not just the relevance of the knowledge and the analysis, but at the same time, it's like I need to thank you for the collective memory that you pose on the research. It's like, we as people that participate in the social movement, we feel and we connect with different moments.
Vemos que conectamos con diferentes momentos de nuestro pasado.
What happened and which were our hypotheses in terms of where does the social change happen, global to local, and then, and now I'm going to your question, Ines, and where are women on those movements? And I'm talking from Latin America, I'm talking from Peru, and if something changed in Latin America in terms of the feminist movement in the past 10 years, where exactly this expression of this new generation of feminist women, younger women, on asking for their rights, and it becomes a new moment that it expressed some things that you highlight on your book. That it take apart on the traditional NGOs or the traditional unions and build these grassroots movements representing their own leadership from school, from neighbors, and they express something that can put together people even from quite conservative sectors. In sometimes in Latin America, we in 2015 with the Ni Una Menos movement, no one left. It was a movement against violence. The women's movement matured an opportunity to connect to different women's rights movement and feminist movement, and it was a really interesting process. But at the same time, and this is something that I think it's relevant to discuss, and we need to learn a lot about the unions. How tough is to continue building these big movements, continue during the time when they express other difference in the agenda. The Ni Una Menos movement against violence mature, and they achieve important things in the countries, but at the internal space of feminist movement, what we call the Ola Verde, the green wave against abortion, legal abortion in Latin America, in a way, strength but break the movement, because it opened the floor for a leftist, for more progressive asking from women's, and then you can feel this kind of strong challenge between generation on the movement. the women, the young women asking for their rights, for reproductive rights as a priority, breaking in Latin America. We are a really conservative society with a lot of presence of church, whatever. And start talking about freedom, body, it was really, really disturbed. And that kind of movement, at the same time, it brings the young feminist movement as a vanguard for other connections, because that movement start talking about freedom, talking about an equity in another way. I don't know if we can conclude, but what happened in the past 6 years in Latin America, in the most important cities in Latin America around the feminist movement, it's related with our middle income countries, our young women from middle classes. They are digital, they are organizing, and they are part of their digital bubbles. You know, this is the generation of an algorithm identity. This is the Me Too identity. This is Ni Una Menos identity, the yellow, you know, pañuelo verde identity, and they play a role. I don't know if we can connect it. I don't know if the research can connect that, but what I saw around Mexico, Colombia, Peru, Argentina, is how this rebuilding grassroots movement of women and young women starting being really disrupting against different things. It opened the floor for connection in terms of generation, but to what we'd call later the Latin American Spring. In 2019, the social closure in Latin America, it was huge. Chile coming to a new social process, and now to a new constitution. We are discussing a new social pact. And how does all the movement in Chile started, and how the movement in Argentina connected with other things started. The same in Peru. I'm talking from Lima, and in the past 6 years we had 6 presidents, and in 4 of them, social movement became essential to recover democracy in a way. And young movements and young women on the movements play a new role that I've seen it before. I haven't seen it before. I think there's a new transformative leadership from young women in Latin America that we need to see. And it's not just Latin America. And that's something that it made me reflect about, which is the global movement for some things. I came from trade agreements on all the scenario where the G20 were, all the global institutions were our targets, and they can define what happened in the country. But now, when I see the Me Too movement, when I see all those reproductive rights movements and all these connections, I see a global connection, a global identity, but not necessarily a global tactic, a global strategic that can change to global to national. And something that is happening is this new fluid digital public space that the digital world brings to the movements, that it really helped to connect, to representate, but it in a way blocked the capacity to open the real political dialogue with the institution to change things, because there's the kind of change that we are promoting in some cases, and the authors pointed well in the book, if they are the Omnibus Protest, they are not just, it doesn't mean that they do not achieve policy changes. Probably they are not achieving all the policy changes that we want, but they are achieving representation, collective identity building. We are disputing narrative. And this is the last thing that I wanted to share. It is interesting to see, and I don't know if you connect with what I will say, that movements are talking about disputing narratives, building the narrative as a scenario of power. From the past, we were talking about power, representation, policy decisions, and now we are disputing something different. And in a way, it's more fluid and have like the sensation of winning, but at the same time, the sensation of moving forward for the last thing that we want. And
Moving forward, I take that as your last word, but this won't be the last word of this panel. Unfortunately, I have to interrupt you, and I unfortunately have to wrap this up because time is out. I want to thank all of you, all of your panelists, all of the authors, and I want to give the last word to Isabel. Thank you very much. It was my pleasure and an honor to moderate this panel. Isabel, what do you take from this discussion? What did you learn? What did surprise you?
Well, I indeed learned many things, but given that there's 1 minute left, I think I'm going to pass the floor to Michael Browning, who is going to close the session. Thank you very much, Ness, and everybody.
I feel like protesting against cutting short this discussion. No, thank you very much. Thank you for a debate that to me really managed the impossible. You managed to take a bird's eye view and at the same time dig deep. And I think that was amazing. Thank you for your contribution. Thank you, Ines, for a wonderful moderation. I'm not going to try to summarize this. I think what we should take with us today is that this is the beginning of a discussion that we should definitely follow up on with. I think that one thing that I'm taking, I feel encouraged to stop believing into this narrative that protests are somehow irrational or illegitimate. I think that what we need is a rehabilitation of protest around the world. And I mean, to quote Lenin, what to do, I think you could do worse in downloading this free book and read it. And with this, I'll let you go. And I hope that you'll enjoy the rest of your day. And I thoroughly enjoyed this discussion. And I promise that there's more to come. Thank you and have a wonderful day around the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.